Well, I was born in Nebraska, October 28th, 1925, on a farm. And this farm was about 2 miles from a town. And the closest town had it was Bradish, and it's no longer there, but it only had like 12 people in it. There was a grocery store, such as it was, and an old man that sold nothing but socks. And then they had granaries where the farmers used to bring their grain in the fall, and then they'd put the grain on a train and haul it away. So we didn't get there very often. And I was the baby of, we're really 10 children, but the second girl, well, the second to the oldest, Pearl, died when she was a baby. So there were 9 of us. And we lived on this farm. We didn't have much money, but we were happy. Everybody was poor, really, but we had more children than most, so we were probably among the poorest, but we were happy. And I'll tell you about the house now. It had a kitchen. It was a pretty big kitchen as I remember it. I suppose if I saw it now, it would be small. But it was a kitchen, and it had a pantry, and a living room, and a bedroom, and a closet downstairs. And upstairs, it was kind of an unfinished attic, but it did have a floor, and they had 4 beds up there. Anyway, back to the kitchen. The pantry had cupboards, and I guess that's where most of the dishes were kept, and the pots and pans, and it had a counter with cupboards below, and there was a door in there that went upstairs. And in the kitchen we had a cook stove. It was a wood cook stove. And on one end there was a reservoir. This is where you kept water. And whenever you used the cook stove, that would heat the water. It was, you had your where you cooked with your pots and pans on one end, and then an oven, and then the reservoir on the right-hand side. And we had a wooden box on one end of the stove where we kept wood for the stove, and then we had a basket we kept cobs to burn. We always saved every piece of wood and every cob that we could to be burned. We didn't have waste baskets because if there was anything to burn, it went in the cook stove, and the leftover potato peelings and such as that was given to the chickens, because they always liked that, and they loved when we had sweet corn, and the chickens got to, we'd throw the cobs out after Mom cut the corn off of the cob, and they would eat every bite off of that cob. And then that cob would be saved, and we would later, when it was dry, burn it. And then we had a cupboard just a cupboard sitting in the corner that we kept a lot of dishes in. And we had a big table, and since I was the baby, by the time I came along, my oldest sister was married, and I have a niece that's just 11 months younger than I, and my oldest brother was already married too. But there were still quite a few to put around the table, and we had this blue bench on one side and then chairs around the rest of the table. And on Sundays, people would drop by, and no matter what, Mom always made a coffee cake. And the coffee cake, she would put cinnamon sugar on the top and bake it, and stretch her coffee and serve them coffee and this coffee cake. And one corner by the door that went outside in the kitchen, we had on the wall a board where they pounded nails in, and that is where we hung our coats. And in the wintertime, we had a rug on the floor where we put our overshoes. We had to have overshoes because we had deep, deep snow in those days. And then for the wash basin, we had a black table. The table was about 3 feet long, and I suppose about 20 inches wide, and I suppose a little over 3 feet high. And we had an enamel wash basin on there, and we had a bucket. I suppose it was an enamel bucket, and it had a dipper in it. And everybody drank out of that dipper. And to get water, we had to go out to the windmill and carry it in. And on wash day, which was probably a Monday, we would have to bring in lots of water and heat it and put in the washing machine. And then Mom had a tub. It was an oblong tub that she rinsed the clothes in. You'd have to heat the water and put in the washing machine, and it had a hand-powered agitator. You'd have to stand there and pull this handle back and forth and to agitate the clothes. And then there was a wringer. Wringer was attached to the washing machine, and you would have to feed the clothes into the wringer and then hand turn it. It was always nice to have somebody put the clothes in and somebody turning the handle, and then that fell into the cold water to rinse them. Well, then you would rinse them and then you'd move the wringer to another side, and you'd have to wring them out again and put them in a basket and take them outside to a clothesline and hang them on the clothesline to dry. During the winter, when you hung clothes out, they would freeze solid. Wouldn't dry very good, and then you could bring them in and stand them in a corner or wherever. Then they'd of course, get soft and fall. But you didn't wash clothes as much during the winter. Well, you didn't get that dirty because the men weren't out working. But a woman's work was never done. She still had a lot of work to do. And Mom made her own soap, and I believe it was made from the cooking fat from butchering and lye and maybe ashes. I can't really remember too much about that, but I know she had a square box that she would put it in, and then when it got hard, she would cut it into bars, and we used that for washing our hands and face. Gee, did we use it on our face? I guess so. And to wash clothes and to wash dishes she had to make enough soap to last. And a lot of cooking pots that went in the pantry, and we used cobs to cook with, and had big pots because we had a lot of soup and a lot of beans. And then into the living room. I remember we had a pot-bellied stove. Now this was not hooked up during the summer. Can't remember where we kept it, but it must have been in the corner. And we did buy coal for the pot-bellied stove. And I guess we had coal delivered like once every fall. And Mom would keep a tea kettle on top, so if anybody wanted hot water, it was always hot. And that's where we used to take our Saturday night bath in the wintertime. We had a tub, and that would be the warmest place, was right next to the stove. And we probably all got in the same water. Not at the same time, of course, but it was too hard to heat more water. And we had a Victrola, a hand-wound Victrola with records. And we had a rocking chair, I remember, and we had a wine-colored sofa. It was an old one by the time I came along. And I think we must have had some braided rugs on the floor. I believe we had linoleum in the kitchen. And during the winter, we used to play cards a lot. And I remember the cards would get pretty sticky because we used them so much and they got dirty. So you just sprinkle a little cornstarch on. And we didn't get a new deck very often. But the deck of cards we had would get like 1.5 inches thick because we used it so much. And then listening to the record player. And then Mom and Dad's bedroom was downstairs. And they had a mattress with bed springs. Now the bed springs then, we didn't have them enclosed in box springs. The bed springs were just open. And we had bed bugs. I think most people had bed bugs in those days. And during the summer, to prevent them, you would take kerosene and a brush and brush the bed springs. And that killed the eggs and the bed bugs. So that really prevented a lot of them. And Mom made all the quilts. We used to have quilting parties where the women would come and stitch them. She had her own sewing machine that was the pedal kind, and she would make the tops and then use some old blankets to put in the middle and stretch them out on the wood frame and have the quilting parties. But nothing went to waste. You say some of these quilts were made from old pieces of suits or dresses, anything that they could put together for a quilt top. And if you were really good at making them, you would make special tops that required a real lot of work. And they had a closet in their bedroom, and they had a dresser. I don't remember too much about that. And then upstairs, you had to go through the pantry and take the steps upstairs. And the chimney from the kitchen and the pot-bellied stove went up through the attic. and the bedroom's up there, and that was the only heat we got in the wintertime, with the 4 beds. Now, when I remember when we were little, we had corn husk mattresses. We had the usual bed springs that were not covered, and then the corn husk mattresses. They were in regular ticking, and every fall you would empty those old corn husks out and put new corn husks in. And you'd get them so they were like 3 feet thick. And then the first time you slept on them, they would really go down, and by spring, there wasn't much left. And then you had blankets that you put on, and the homemade quilts, and the pillows. The pillows were made from the feathers you saved when you had butchered a chicken or a goose. You always saved every feather that was good for pillows. And you made the pillows. You had ticking for the pillows. And we had the 4 beds. And we would have to, every spring, put kerosene on so that the bed bugs wouldn't get too bad. We usually didn't have them too bad because we were pretty careful about putting the kerosene on. And during the winter, we had 1 window on each end of the upstairs. I remember they didn't fit very good because when we had wind and snow, there would be snow inside on the windowsill. Not a lot, but there was still snow that had come through. And canning. Well, first I'll go into making the garden. We had a big garden. And you can imagine when you had, 6, 7 kids at home, took a lot of food. But we never went hungry. I never remember of going hungry living on the farm, because we had the cow and we had chickens and we had the garden. People that lived in town during the Depression of the 30s were not as lucky as farmers. So I never, ever remember of being hungry. And the garden was a big garden. During the spring, Dad would get out Jack and Molly, our two mules, and plow. It was a big area, pretty close to the house. And he would plow it, and then he would harrow it, and then we would take a hoe, and I didn't do too much of that. I did plant some of the seed, but and then you make a row and plant seed in it, and then there were certain rows you would take a stick and make a hole and drop a couple of seeds in, and then cover it up with dirt. And Mom would plant carrots and peas and green beans and lima beans and navy beans and onions, little green onions, and then the big onions. She had to plant enough that she could can and make some of this last all year. And potato patch, there was a big potato patch because we had to plant enough potatoes to last a whole year. And then at the end of the season, Mom always left enough of the carrots and the onions and some of those vegetables to go to seed. And then she would watch it carefully and then cut it off and put it on a paper and let it dry. So then I guess she must have put the seeds in jars to save for the next spring so she would have the seeds to plant again. And we had cabbages and squash and cucumbers and cantaloupe and watermelon and all those kind of vegetables. Well, when you have that kind of a garden, you have to can all of that. And I remember I would help Mom with the peas, shelling the peas. And that was a hard job, but it took so many peas. We'd have to go out and pick the peas and then bring them in and then shell them. And Mom would have to can these peas. The same thing with the carrots and the beans and the string beans and the lima beans and all of that. And put it in jars. And she had big enamel container that she would put on the stove and put the vegetables in jars and then put it in this enamel container, and it would be on the stove for a long time. And then after she took them out with the lids on, when she took them out, then she would tighten the lid. And then after they got cool, we would take and put them in the cave. Now our cave was a hole in the ground that had to be dug, and we didn't have it cemented in like a lot of them did, but we had wooden steps that went down and a wooden door, and then the top was cemented to keep the dirt from falling. And then they had shelves on the side, and that used to be so beautiful just to see all of those jars at the end of the canning season. We also planted, of course, tomatoes. Mom made her own ketchup, tomato sauce, and chili sauce. She did a lot of that. And then it just looked so nice to have all of these jars of fruit. During the fall, they would have to buy bushel baskets of peaches and pears and apples. Sometimes we got apples from a neighbor. And then I believe we had one apple tree. That was a crab apple tree. And she would make crab apples, pickled crab apples, and applesauce, and can that. And in the back of the cave, it was a pretty big cave. In the back of the cave, it was partitioned off with 2 posts, and then you would add wooden boards, because in the fall when you gathered all the potatoes, you had to have some place to store them for a year. So you would bring in the potatoes and put them on the dirt floor, and maybe they put gunny sacks down. I'm not so sure about that. And put the potatoes on there, and we would carry them in bucket by bucket. And then as it started filling up, you would add a board so they wouldn't overflow. And just keep piling the potatoes. They had to last all winter, and you had to have a couple of bushels left to plant the next spring. And by the next spring, they were starting to grow. And you would take a knife and cut the potato and make sure there was an eye on each potato that you planted, and that would make it grow. If it didn't have an eye with the sprout, it wouldn't grow. And Mom would take the cabbage and put in gunny sacks. Now a gunny sack can breathe, not like the plastic they have nowadays. If you had put it in plastic, it would just mold. But the gunny sacks could breathe. and she'd put pumpkins by the potatoes and squash and onions. We had to raise enough onions to last until we had our garden the next year. They would even kind of start growing by the next season. But we used a lot of onions because an onion will flavor an awful lot of things. Because we didn't always have meat, so we had a lot of stew, and an onion would flavor the stew. And you could even keep carrots for about 2 months, maybe 3 in the cave, with the tops still attached. And it was always cool there, the same temperature. So Mom always used that first before you started using the canned goods. And then we had chickens. They had the chicken house. I remember it wasn't one of the better chicken houses. And during the winter, they must have gotten pretty cold, but they had a roost to sit on. That's where chickens always sat, on a roost. And they must have sat close together to keep from freezing, because snow would come in. And Mom saved the potato peelings, and she would cook them in this old enamel wash basin. Just a little, because if you put cold water on them, they'd freeze by the time the chickens got through. So she always cooked them and put them out for the chickens in the chicken house, and they loved getting those potato peelings. And then we would have corn for them to eat. And then they had their nests in the chicken house that they laid their eggs in. And you must have chickens because you needed eggs for so many things. I have an idea we had eggs for breakfast and probably for dinner too. And so you always had to have your chickens and take good care of them. But you had to lock them up at night because there were coyotes. And the coyotes were smart. If you didn't have them fastened tight, they would get in your chicken house and take your chickens. And you had to make sure you had straw in the nests so the chickens could lay their eggs. And you gathered them during the winter, I think like twice, so they wouldn't freeze and break open. And right next to the chicken house was the outdoor toilet. Inside at night, we had chamber pots. We didn't have electricity. We didn't have running water. But then we didn't have any bills coming in either. So I believe we had a mailbox. I don't remember it, but we must have had one. Because I think maybe once or twice a year we'd get a letter. So the mailman must have known where everybody lived. And the wood, I'll get back to the outdoor toilet. I believe it was a 2-holer. And when that got full, you'd have to dig a new hole. It filled that one up with the dirt you took from the next one. And summer and winter, you went out to that outdoor toilet. And it had the proverbial moon on the door. Half moon. I can't remember why, but everybody had a half moon on their outdoor toilet. And we had a few trees. Because I remember we would cut wood with a hand saw. Dad and Jiggs and Norman, Dad and then Jiggs, that's Ivan, and Norman would cut the wood and then chop it and pile it along the north side of the chicken house. That protected the chickens some, and because the cold wind always came from the north. And during the winter, we'd have to make sure we brought some in. So we'd have wood. Well, we always had to have wood in the house since we had a wood cook stove. And above the wood cook stove, there was a warming oven. You could cook something and fix it. You know, you could only cook so many eggs at one time, and you put them on a platter and put them up in the warming oven that was on the top. And it would keep them warm, and so that when somebody came to eat, they could have hot food. Mom made her own bread. She, I forgot to mention about the flour. When we would go to Bradish, the grocery store, Mom would have to buy, I think it was 100-pound sacks of flour. And she would buy flour, sugar, salt, and a few spices. And that is about all we would ever buy at a grocery store. We raised everything else, and the flour sacks she saved and made the dish towels out of them. And then later they started putting flour in sacks that had print on them. And you were lucky if you could get 2 sacks with the same print, and you could make a dress out of it. And the salt sacks, I still have. She embroidered, she appliqued. Still have salt sacks that have the imprint of the salt. So I know she used those to make quilts. And then the salt and the sugar. The sugar probably came in a cloth sack also. I can't remember, but it must have. But I know the salt did, and the flour came in cloth sacks. And you used a lot of flour because Mom made her own bread. And then when you butchered, you had to have a lot of salt because Mom had a great big crock. It was called a crock. And it was a great big one that was in the cave. And she put lots of salt in there. And that made the brine. And when you butchered, you had to put your pork in this salt, and it would keep it for 6-7 months, all during the winter. Every fall, Dad would butcher a pig, and I don't remember too much about that because I didn't like to watch it, but they would have something to hang it up by the back feet and shave all the hair off. And then take the guts or the insides out and give that all to the chickens. The chickens loved that. That was a lot for them to eat. And then they would be cut apart. I can't remember where he cut it up. But anyway, would be cut up, and there would be parts of the pig put in the brine, parts of it was canned, and the tail, everything was used except the hoofs. And the tail, Mom would cook a pot of beans the first day with the tail that flavored the beans. The navy beans, they were called in those days. Now they're little beans, little navy beans or something. And she made head cheese, and I'm sure she cooked the tongue. And the ears went in with the beans to make bean soup. And I really can't remember too much about the butchering of it because I didn't watch it. But I know Mom used to make sausage. Now this all had to be done in one day. The butchering of the pig, taking care of all the meat, making the sausage. I believe a couple of neighbors would come over and help because we had no refrigeration. So it had to be done quick. And you made sausage, grind it up, and they used some of the guts. Clean them out and wash them, and then put the sausage in the gut part, and it made sausages. And
Okay.
See. Oh yeah, the pig. We, Mom would have the neighbors, a couple of neighbors would come over and help, and you would, to make sausage, you would use a lot of spices, and then push it through a sausage maker of the gut after you had cleaned the gut, and put the sausage in there. And I have an idea the sausage was canned, put in a jar, a fruit jar, and probably cooked partially in Mom's big enameled blue container that she used for canning. And or maybe she just made enough and we used it all within a couple of days, since we had no refrigeration. But we did put the pig in the brine, and she canned some. Oh, and the pig's feet. Mom always pickled the pig's feet. Now, that was probably in a vinegar brine, and that was eaten the first few days also. But, or maybe she even canned some. I can't remember that. But it was a very busy day for the man and the woman. And it was always done in the fall after the harvesting was done. Then you were ready for winter, because during the winter we had a lot of snow. The snow in the 1930s was deep. Going to school, we could walk over the fence posts going to school. And I had the proverbial 2 miles to school. And that was rough going, walking to school. Sometimes I wanted to cry by the time I got there, but my brothers and sisters said, "Don't cry, it'll freeze to your face." So I didn't cry, but it was so good to get to school and get warm, but then you'd have to walk home. Now this schoolhouse, it was actually 2 rooms and a basement, and it had 2 teachers. This was District 12, Voorhees Valley School. And there were probably 10, 12 children under the 8th grade, and then 9, 10, and 11, 9 and 10. 11 and 12th grade, you had to go into Albion to go to school. And, but it was, you got to know your neighbors that way. And we used to have programs, Christmas programs, where you could sing Christmas songs, Christmas carols, all the joy to the world, and have a nativity scene in school. That was permitted in the 1930s, to have a nativity and have Jesus come It wasn't all just Santa Claus. You got to have Jesus. And so that was very nice, something we had in those days. Well, getting back to the farm. Well, one time we had a great big barn. And in 1932 or 1933, there was a tornado that tore that barn down, and one of the boards ended up in our neighbor's granary. This was a half a mile away, and one of our barn boards ended up in their granary. So we had to have a new barn built. Well, in the barn, you had to have a barn on a farm, because that's where you milked your cows and kept your hay and your straw. And I think we must have kept our coal in the barn. And but when we had it built, during that Depression years, it was much smaller. And I remember for fertilizer, Dad used cow manure. And there were a couple of times a year, we had a manure spreader. He would take the manure spreader out to the pasture and pick up the cow pancakes that were dried. Now, these cow pancakes, when they were dry, you could pick them up with a pitchfork. And he would put them in the manure spreader, or sometimes, I think he put some in a wagon, and then he would make a pile by the barn. And all the manure, even from the barn, would be put on this manure pile. And then in the spring, he would put it in the manure spreader, and at the back, it would turn some kind of a lever, and it would break up the cow pancakes, and he would go over the garden and before you planted the seeds, and before he worked in the fields and planted corn, he would take the manure spreader, and that was our fertilizer. We didn't have all this fancy fertilizer that they have nowadays, but it was free. It was just work. You had to do a lot of work in those days because we just had Jack and Molly. We didn't have a tractor. We didn't even have a car in those first few years. We didn't have a car until about 1934, 1935. And and I forgot, at the grocery store, we did buy kerosene because we had kerosene lamps and no electricity, so we had the kerosene lamps. We did have a telephone in about 1935 because Mama was sick, and so we were allowed to have a telephone. And that was the kind you would ring, one long or two short, something like that. I wish I had that phone now, but it's all gone. And I think I drifted off here. Where was I? Oh, the barn and the fertilizer. You had to have fertilizer to help make things grow. And so you used the horse manure and the cow manure, and you'd spread it out on the fields to grow your corn. And that's all we grew, I believe. I don't believe we grew any wheat. I think it was mostly corn. And then when you wanted money in the fall, you would take that corn and you would sell it at Bradish, and they would put it in the granary, and that would give us some money, and then you would buy your flour and your sugar and your salt and your kerosene and your spices, enough to last all winter. And we had a wagon that we used to go to the store in Bradish. And I think the furthest I ever got away from home was that we went to Genoa. Genoa was about 15 to 20 miles from our house. And I remember going there just very few times because we went by wagon. And you would leave early in the morning. And then it would take, I can't remember how many hours to get there. But we didn't go very often. And then when we got the car, I believe we went more often. And then Mama died on May 14th, 1936. She had cancer, and she had been sick for a long time, about a year. And then when Mama died, I went to live with my oldest sister, who was married, and she had a daughter that was 11 months younger than I, and another daughter that was about 5. I was 10, Lois was 9, Mary Lou was 4 or 5. And I lived with them for a year. Now, they had a pump in the house that, I forgot to tell you about my windmill at home. We had a windmill, and during the winter, you had to put your hat on, your coat, and your gloves and overshoes to go out and carry in buckets of water because we didn't have a faucet and we didn't have a pump in the house. So we had to go out and pump it. And it was really cold, and you had to have gloves on to pump the pump out there. We didn't always have the windmill running because the cows had, Dad had to go out and chop a hole in the ice for the cattle to drink. We didn't have the luxury of a heater in the tank for the cattle. But so he had to chop a hole once or twice a day to make sure that the cows could get some water to drink. And then it would freeze over, and he'd have to go out and chop it open with an axe, and so they could get some water. And during the summer, though, they drank a lot of water, and the wind would blow the windmill, and it would pump itself. But if you didn't have the windmill going, of course, that water all went into the tank for the cows, so we had to have our own hand pump by the windmill, and you pump that for the water. The pump had a little catch on it that you hung your pail on so it wouldn't fall off. It did have that little hook up there. And you'd carry 2 buckets of water, especially when you had to do the laundry. And then hang all your laundry outside in the on the clothesline. And Well, I believe that's about all on the farm, unless I think of something else. But we were happy there. During the summer, we never wore shoes. We always just went barefoot because your shoes for going special places. Not that we went that much, and we were lucky to get shoes to go to school in the fall. So we always went barefoot, and we loved it. Then we hated putting shoes on when it was time to go to school. Oh, and I had long stockings. They were cotton stockings. And underwear, the long johns. Every winter you had to wear that had long sleeves and buttons in the back to drop seat and long legs on the underwear, and you would have to fold them over on the bottom and then pull these long stockings up over it and put elastic around the legs to hold the socks up. They called them garters, and but they were made just out of elastic. And Mom used to make my pants, for all of us, and they were called bloomers. And they had elastic in the bloomer bottoms and elastic around the waist. I hated those things. And they were made out of flannel. I believe we wore those summer and winter. And I don't think they have long-legged underwear. Maybe they do back east. They may still wear it. I suppose you can find it someplace. Probably in Alaska they need it, in Canada. But anyway, I didn't like wearing the long-legged underwear. And so then after Mama died, I went to live with my oldest sister because my dad and then they say that was Jiggs and Norman were still at home by then. And they went to, I think, Washington, the state of Washington. So our farm was just kind of turned over to Uncle George. That was Dad's brother, and he had the farm next to ours. They were kind of attached. So there was something to do with, if Mama died, that then the farm, they were Grandma's farms, Grandma Peterson's farms, for Uncle George and Dad. I never really understood that. But now, Clarence Choate, my sister married Elmer Choate, and Clarence Choate was his brother, and now Clarence Choate's son owns our farm. They own a lot of farms there now. So it's my sister Ruth's nephew. So it's kind of back in the family in a roundabout way. Doesn't belong to Uncle George anymore because he was a lazy old thing. Kind of mean, and his oldest sons were very mean. So it's kind of back in the family. And all that's on our farm now is a pump. The pump is still there. They took the house after Mama died and put it over on their farm and took all of Mama's stuff out and Dad's and used it as a granary. One thing, when Edith, my oldest sister that I lived with after Mama died, she took me back home after about 3 or 4 days, and Dad was not there, and Norman wasn't there, or Jiggs, and Ruth was working in town at the time, she took the picture. Mama had a picture of the Last Supper, and Edith took that. That was the only thing she took from the house. There would be so much more things I would have loved to have gotten, but I didn't. I guess we planned to come back to it someday, but then it was gone. Anyway, I now have that picture of the Last Supper, and that was Mama's. And I lived with Edith, her husband, and 2 daughters for a year and went to school in the 5th grade. And that was a nice, good, happy time. They had a pump in the house, still an outdoor toilet. But the 3 girls, we 3 girls slept in one bed. They only had 2 bedrooms. And then the next year, I went to live with my oldest brother and his wife and their son. Donovan was, he was about 5, I guess, when I was 12 by then. And he had a big bed, and I had a cot in the corner of his room. Esther really didn't like me. That was my brother Kenneth's wife. She resented, I believe, having me live there, but I lived there for 2 years. But every summer and every vacation, I had to go to my sister Goldie's place and stay with her. And Goldie had married Jack Eilers, and they had about 3 kids at that time. But that was, I guess I got along with them. I was glad to have some place to live, and I guess it really didn't bother me. Maybe underneath it did. And then I was with Esther and Ken for 2 years, went to school, and walked every day and then come home, and I helped Esther a lot with the work. And then I went to live the 9th and 10th grade with my sister Letha and her husband, Kermit Cruz. And they had, I believe, 2 kids, and then one was born, or they had 3 kids, and one was born while I was there. And that was a happy place. And they had, Kermit had made a well, so we had water in the house, and he had hooked up a generator, and we had electricity. About out. Well, that's about it for this tape. I'm running out of time, so it will be continued on another tape.